we're going to talk about St. Mark of Ephesus a minute before we go back to our own day and talk about the origins and the history of ecumenism, because it's important for us to remember St. Mark and what happened. How many do not know about St. Mark of Ephesus and the false council of Florence? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So throughout the church history of the last 1,000 years, there's been many attempts to unite the Orthodox Church, the one holy Catholic Church, with the Pope and the Papal Church, the Papal Confession in the West, right? There's many attempts. The two most notable are in the Council of Florence, and before that, the attempt by the emperor, essentially, to unite with the Pope in the so-called Council of Lyon. Both of them failed, and the main reason the second one failed was because of St. Mark of Ephesus and his witness. And they were both essentially politically driven for the sake of the empire, to save the empire from the imminent advance of Islam. The first less so, but the second one very clearly driven by political desires. Today we have the same problem. Today we have politically driven efforts, indeed by people outside the church, unrelated to the church, driving political, religious leaders to unite for reasons that have nothing to do with salvation or church unity, but have everything to do with global politics, geopolitics, and all the rest. So this is the perennial temptation in the church, mainly through political power. If you go back to the iconoclasts, you go back to the various emperors who tried to force a faith on the church, it's usually the devil using the power of this world, the political power, to force the church into compromises and distortions. St. Mark of Ephesus was one of the representatives of the church chosen by the emperor. He was actually a hieromonk when he was chosen. They made him the metropolitan of Ephesus, and he was renowned for his theology. He was a teacher in Constantinople and was well known as a layman among the people in the court of the emperor. And then he left and became a monk, came back a few years later into a monastery in Constantinople, lived there, became very well known because he was extremely erudite and virtuous as a monastic. And he was elevated to this position of the Metropolitan of Ephesus in order to represent the Orthodox Church in this union attempt in Florence in Italy. And so he was actually beloved by the emperor, and he went along with the rest of the representatives, about 30, I think, most of them also handpicked by the emperor to this council that was going to be in Florence. It started in Ferrara, and then it went to Florence, Italy. Now, this went on for about 3 years, actually. Believe it or not, it's kind of hard to imagine today. We had a council in Crete, and it was a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, I don't remember. And it was a big deal, right? This went on for 3 years, 2.5 years. And there were many, many sessions, and they were waiting for months and months and months for money and different. It's a very involved history. In any case, it came to a point where the emperor essentially was pushing the representatives of the Orthodox Church to compromise on the filioque, the famous phrase that was added, distorted the theology of the Trinity and was added to the creed in the West. That was really the cause of the falling away of the Pope from the Orthodox Church. When they walked away from the Eighth Ecumenical Council that had happened in Constantinople, they adopted the filioque. They turned their back on the conciliar nature of the church, the decisions of ecumenical councils, and that's what took them out of the Orthodox Church. The Pope walked away from the decisions of an ecumenical council. So that was one of the main topics they talked about. Also, the place of the Pope, the power of the Pope was another one. Also, purgatory, the idea in the West that there is a in-between state, which the fathers have never embraced and never talked about in the West, in the East. And also the so-called azymes. In the West, they had started to make the bread that they used in the Eucharist was not leaven. And so that was a distortion, a departure from Holy Tradition. And there were other issues they discussed as well. The main one, again, is the question of the filioque, the Holy Trinity. In any case, they slowly, after much time, after being starved for a time, there's a whole history. You can read the whole history. It's been recorded by several people. There was a lot of pressure on them to compromise for the sake of political expediency. St. Mark, of course, was revered as the most erudite of the representatives, and he refused. He refused to give way, even after the emperor and the pope were both of them pressuring him, trying to coax him, and all the rest. And he, famously, the pope said, if Mark does not agree, we've accomplished nothing. Because he knew that Mark was the hero of the Orthodox. He would go back to Constantinople, and they would not have achieved their goal of subjecting Orthodoxy to the papacy. And that's really what it was about. I mean, the whole pageantry of the Council of Florence had them bowing initially and kissing the slipper of the Pope. I'm not joking when I say that. That was what they expected the Orthodox to do. Of course, the emperor insisted they not do that, so he kissed his hand, not the slipper. But I mean, the whole push there in the West, after 400 years, they had elevated the Pope to a position that, of course, never existed in the East, and was just like an emperor, but even greater than an emperor, because he had divine, representing the divinity on earth. So the Pope St. Mark responded, and I'm going to read that to you now. We could talk for a whole hour and a half just on St. Mark, but we're just going to get a couple excerpts, because I want you to see what the church has held up as the proper position when it comes to dogmatic matters and union with the heterodox. You have to understand, this is not just a saint. The church has held him up for the last 500 years as an example for us to follow. So we should be very familiar with him and his life, and not simply say, well, as many people do today, they rationalize it and they talk all about the history. Whatever the details of the history, the church ended up saying he kept orthodoxy. They call him the Atlas of orthodoxy. And now St. Mark responded at the very end of this process, refusing to compromise. To the Pope's words, Mark gave an extensive commanding reply concerning the interdictions with which the Pope threatened him. He said the following: the councils of the church have condemned as rebels those who have transgressed against some dogma and have preached thus and fought for this. For which reason also they called heresy. They are called heretics. In other words, those who rebel against the conciliar teachings of the church and transgress the dogmas are called heretics. That's the term we use for those who refuse to accept the ecumenical councils. And that's what happened with the Pope in the 11th century. And from the beginning, the church has condemned the heresy itself. Only then, after condemning the heresy, has it condemned the leaders of the heresy and its defenders. But I have by no means preached my own teaching, nor have I introduced anything new in the church, nor defended any foreign and false doctrine. But I have held only that teaching which the church received in perfect form from our Savior, and in which it has steadfastly remained to this day. What do we say from the beginning of every talk, and what we say again and again? Following the Holy Fathers. St. Mark is saying, look, I'm not creating, I'm not innovating, I'm not making this up. Whatever we received, I'm passing on to those after me. That's the nature of what the church has done. There is no development of doctrine in the Orthodox Church. That's a Roman Catholic idea. Doctrine does not develop in the slightest. It is revelation, it's given. What is applied is not developed. It's very important, because the idea in the West with Newman and others is that we have revelations, as it were, within Holy Tradition. We understand, yes, it's the same experience, but we understand late, and then we dogmatize. No, nothing is newly given, nothing is newly discovered. What we're doing is the same experience that we have, we're putting boundaries around that to say this teaching is outside that boundary. It's given, we receive it, and then we say, we don't, at the council, we're not saying, oh, let's see, what's the faith? Let's see, oh, that's the faith. No, it's the experience of the fathers simply put down on paper, and a boundary putting around it, and saying that's what's been given to us, confirming that, reconfirming that, and then saying this new teaching on ecumenism or on the filioque is not within those boundaries. That's all we're doing in the ecumenical councils. After the false union, pay attention how St. Mark lived and what he did, because there will be a false union very likely in our lifetime, if not in the next couple of years. And I don't say that as I'm not a prophet. I'm just repeating what others are telling me in Greece, on Mount Athos, and among the saints of our day. They're expecting a false union in the near future. And there's a lot of signs that they're working toward it even in our day. And it may even come in a few years. So this is an important example for us to have in mind. He says, St. Mark says, or they say about him, I'm sorry, this is his brother John Evgenikos, who was talking about his life after returning to Ephesus and in the East. Actively traveling everywhere throughout the regions of the great evangelist and John the theologian, that means Ephesus, and doing this over long periods and with labor and difficulty, being sick in body, visiting the suffering holy churches, and especially constructing the church of the metropolis with the adjoining buildings, ordaining priests, helping those suffering injustice, whether by reason of persecution or some other trial from the side of the unrighteous, defending widows and orphans, shaming, interdicting, comforting, exhorting, appealing, strengthening. He was, according to the divine apostle, everything for everyone. So St. Mark didn't go back and say, the world is over, the union has happened, the end of the world, but he kept on working and struggling and teaching and serving. I think you went one too far. Go to the next one. There we go. That's where we need. He also says about the question of those who had embraced the union. So initially the union had been agreed to, and then in Constantinople, after a few years, they had a union liturgy just before the fall, and they united in Eucharistic communion. And at this point, St. Mark is basically standing against the emperor and all those bishops who went along with him. There are monastics who are with St. Mark. There are a lot of faithful, but for the most part, the episcopacy has sold out, and they're following the emperor and the Latins and those sent by the Pope to basically direct things in Constantinople. Among former Orthodox, like Isidore from Moscow and Bessarion, who are apostates, who apostatized during the Council of Florence and became cardinals in the West. They came now back, and they were kind of running the show from behind the scenes. So you had this scene where you have Mark and the faithful and the monastics, and you have the vast majority of the episcopacy in union with the Pope at the end of his life. And he says, I am convinced that the further I depart from him, the patriarch, in other words, those who had become a communion with the Latins, and from those like him, the Latin-minded, the closer I draw near to God and all the faithful and all the holy fathers, and the more I am separated from them, by so much more am I united to the truth and the holy fathers. So he said this about the papal Protestants. I like to call them the papal Protestants because the Pope was the first Protestant. He's not a pre-Protestant. He's the first Protestant. He's the example that the Protestants followed. He protested and walked away from the unity of the church and the conciliar nature of the church, and he gave the example for all those who followed after him. So he says, the farther I am for those who united with them, the closer I am to the Holy Fathers. How much more should someone say that today? When we have a Vatican I, we have a Vatican II, we have a dissolution even of the tradition that they had in the West, and we have general chaos and clown masses and on and on and on and on. The dissolution of Catholicism before our eyes is probably would have been unthinkable 50 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, where they've arrived in the West today. So St. Mark should be an example for us. Very decisive, very clear about where we need to be. So then he was arrested by the emperor, and for 2 years he was in prison. And he says, I've been arrested, but the word of God and the power of truth cannot be bound, but all the stronger flow and prosper. And many of the brethren, encouraged by my exile, overthrow the reproaches of the lawless and the violators of the Orthodox faith and the customs of the fatherland. So he went to prison for 2 years. He was released later because they could see that it was not helping their cause. And yet he suffered for the Orthodox faith. Did we know that? Did you know that he went to prison for 2 years? I think most people don't know that. Next one. His brother who wrote his life said he knew that his confession was indispensable because, as he wrote, if there had been no persecution, the martyrs would not have shone, nor would the confessors have received the crown of victory from Christ, and by their exploits strengthen and gladden the Orthodox Church. he consciously knew that he needed to have this stance, and by this stance, the church would be built up. And I think that's something we also need to keep in mind, that it's not, do not look at the externals. Do not look at we need to, many people think like in these terms, we need to not be persecuted, not sent in exile because we need to stay and have the bishopric or have the priest's position. We not be defrocked, not be exiled, not be suspended. And that's most important. And then the confession of the faith is somewhere down here. That's not the position that St. Mark had. Now they had unified, right? So we don't have an open Eucharistic communion right now with the Latin-minded. So it's a little bit different, but you can see his decisiveness is very clear. And I think that going forward, we have to have that in mind. When, and it's very likely in our lifetime, there will be Eucharistic communion by certain Orthodox hierarchs with the Pope. Remember what St. Mark did and how he lived.